In 1941, the Germans moved their panzer divisions through North Africa to push back the British forces in Libya. One major supply port became a war zone, Tobruk. It was here that Rommel scored his greatest victory and became known as the Desert Fox. Johann Sen was in Rommel's Africa Panzer Army. He met the enemy in the African desert on the battlefront. The winter of 1940 brings trouble to the Italian occupation of North Africa. For the first time in World War II, British tanks under the leadership of General Sir Richard O'Connor roll into northern Libya. They advance 560 miles across the desert, wiping out 9 Italian divisions, capturing 130,000 men, and destroying 380 tanks. An important fighting unit is made up of Australians who single-handedly capture over half the Italian-Libyan army.
I don't think most Italian soldiers perhaps didn't really believe in the cause of supporting Hitler, but most of the Italian army was captured or escaped back to Tripoli. Then the Germans started sending in reinforcements. I don't think that the Australians and New Zealanders and the British necessarily felt fear about this, but they were certainly concerned that this was going to make it a much harder fight.
To help his Axis allies, Hitler creates the German Afrika Corps, consisting of tanks and artillery. As leader of this special unit, Hitler appoints a veteran commander of World War I, Erwin Rommel. Neither Rommel nor his troops are trained in desert warfare. But as soon as panzer troops land in North Africa, Rommel sends his units to the battlefront to test British defenses. Along with one of the panzer divisions in the desert heat is Johann Sen.
Well, it's very uncomfortable. We had some soldiers that came from Russia. They say, oh, I wish I would be in Russia. At least there is a tree. It's all desert and hot. Well, the Italian army, that's why we went to Africa to help them out, because they couldn't do anything against England. That was our goal, you know, I mean, so they sent our marshal Rommel to clean up, and he did. Well, I was the Panzer Grenadier, which is a name for a fighter behind the tanks. It's a great like a soldier.
Driving over 500 miles at the beginning of April, Rommel advances into the British lines at Benghazi with lightning speed. He is just beginning his most illustrious campaign. Within 10 days, the Germans have cut a swath through northern Libya, from the western border near Tripoli to the far edge of Egypt. But they need a port to provide a supply line from the Mediterranean. The only possible candidate is Tobruk, because of its deep harbor and location between Benghazi and Alexandria.
We went to Tobruk. I saw lots of cadavers and all that. Was horrible. I was not happy to see that, of course. Actually, you know, when you're young, you just go along. I didn't even worry about nothing. Well, I had to fight, and that was it. It was exciting. Marshal Rommel, yeah, we loved him. 3 times I saw him. I didn't even recognize him because he was full of dust from the desert, and he was tapping on my shoulder. He, how are you doing? And I said, fine. And all of a sudden I recognized him.
Rommel's speedy entry into the fray has given the British cause for alarm.
Rommel surprisingly attacked much earlier than they expected. And of course, he used the tactics that Germans had used in France of pushing his tanks forward, very blitzkrieg tactics. And the Allies rapidly began to fear being encircled. In North Africa, it's very difficult to form a line where you can't be outflanked. So they retreated to the east, because because if you got into a firefight, then the German tanks would go around your flanks, so you're better to get out. I think it was more of a very quick retreat, and it ended up to the east of Tobruk. The commander-in-chief of the forces in the Middle East had realised that if you held Tobruk, you really stopped the German-Italian army advancing too far to the east. Rommel performed well in the Battle of France, but I don't think his reputation preceded him to that extent in North Africa. His very daring attack, which pushed them out of Libya, certainly got their attention. I don't think there was any defeatist feeling amongst the Allied troops in North Africa. They knew it was difficult to operate in the desert, but it was also difficult for the Germans. You see, the further east they operated, the longer their supply route.
By April 11th, Tobruk is isolated. The Germans take full advantage of the opportunity.
Both Australians and New Zealanders had operated in the desert in the First World War, and the German propaganda machine started claiming that they were like rats and they were living underground, and the troops started using the term the rats of Tobruk as something to be proud of. Every soldier would dig a slit trench. A slit trench is really just a hole in the ground big enough for a soldier. If you're attacked from the air, a slit trench is your best chance of survival. When the defending force is being attacked, their first instinct is to get below ground, and one or two men would build a slit trench, and the German tanks would come and cross these slit trenches. The infantry didn't have the weapons to deal with them. What the Australians and New Zealanders would tend to do is wait in the slit trenches for the infantry that would be coming behind the tanks and then engage them. This is where their tactic sort of blunted the blitzkrieg to some extent, because the tanks were sort of stranded. It was a very clean area to fight a war. There's not the civilians. It's sort of a more chivalrous environment. And certainly they developed a respect for the Germans. They thought the Germans were a bit like them in some ways, that they were not a bad outfit. They respected them as fighters.
With the German onslaught derailed, Axis infantry breaks up in complete disorder. Instead of risking greater losses, Rommel waits for the arrival of panzer reinforcements. Meanwhile, the German Luftwaffe bombs and strafes the British forces at Tobruk. the end of May, there is a lull in the fighting. Despite heavy losses from German bombers and submarines, the Royal Navy manages to deliver 84 tons of supplies a day and 16,000 reinforcements. Tobruk's strategic importance has increased with the British loss of Crete.
A lot of Australian soldiers were on Crete. There's probably about 6,000. And of course, mainly Australian garrison of Tobruk would have been very concerned. I don't think the troops in Tobruk feared that the Germans would then use their paratroops on them. They thought they would use them on Malta, which was the key to the whole battle in North Africa. For some of the troops in the perimeter, the fall of Crete probably came as a relief because they knew that they would get more support from the Navy. Of course, all the troops didn't want to see an Allied force defeated, but if it was going to happen, once it was out of the way, then they could focus on what was really important, which was really in North Africa, not Crete.
June 15th, supplied through Tobruk, the British now have more tanks, more men, and more planes than the Germans. British Commander-in-Chief General Sir Archibald Wavell launches his army to destroy Rommel's forces once and for all. The Germans begin a retreat.
The British, they were well armed when they counterattacked us. That's why we retreat. We were sad. We couldn't believe it, that can happen. Well, we were not thinking about that we're gonna lose. I said we're gonna make a counterattack. And of course, Hitler gave us, not to surrender.
Rommel has anything but surrender in mind. He gets far enough ahead of the British and then turns his force around and counterattacks. His strategy works, and the British lose 2/3 of their tanks. Infantry casualties are high. General Wavell's operation is a failure, and the British are driven back to where they started.
The troops in Tobruk were noticeably aggressive. The commander of the Australian 9th Division, which was the main force there, Mooreshead, was determined that his troops would engage the enemy, not just sit on their backsides and wait for the Allies to relieve them. He wanted to get out and attack, and he did that very successfully. It meant that the Germans had to keep a lot more forces around Tobruk than they would have necessarily had to, and the force had been very passive. One of the keys to infantry fighting is to dominate the no man's land between the two forces, and he made sure that his troops adopted a very aggressive approach. This became quite difficult because as the perimeter became more established, there was lots of mines laid, booby traps became quite difficult to push through. The Allies laid mines as well, so both sides were sort of, in the end, sitting behind fields of mines, which to some extent made it more difficult to be aggressive.
Churchill removes Wavell from command and sends General Claude Auchinleck to succeed him. The Rats of Tobruk and the Western Desert Force combine to form the British 8th Army. Infantry and armored brigades of Scots, English, Australians, Poles, Indians, South Africans, and New Zealanders prepare for the biggest British offensive yet, Operation Crusader. Late in 1941, the British 8th Army is poised on the Libyan border, about to launch Operation Crusader, their biggest offensive yet against Rommel's German and Italian armies. But most of the tough Australian contingent has already been sent home.
The siege of Tobruk continued till November, but the Australians were withdrawn in September and October from Tobruk. The troops were very tired and the Australian government insisted on them being taken out of the perimeter. All but one battalion were withdrawn overnight. Troops would be brought in and the Australians would go out on the warships that brought them in. So this had happened. One battalion was left in Tobruk.
November 18th, 1941, the Allied attack begins.
Operation Crusader was an attempt to relieve Tobruk again. There were two corps involved in the Crusader operation. One of the corps was basically British armour, and the other corps was the New Zealand Division and the British Armoured Brigade. And these forces were involved in quite an intricate battle which hung in the balance for a long time, and we suffered substantial losses. But the upshot was that New Zealand forces broke through to the Tobruk perimeter, and that was one Australian battalion in there, so basically it was a link up between the Australians and New Zealanders.
In the face of the large Allied assault, Rommel rallies his forces and counter-thrusts. German tanks cut right through the British lines. They smash 8th Army headquarters and keep going. The Germans attempt to force the English back and take Tobruk. Rommel's daring plan nearly pays off, but his supplies are stretched too thin.
Oh, he was concerned, yeah, because as 10 boats, they left Italy or somewhere else. Maybe one or two arrived. They were sunk from the British airplane or submarine. I think the Italians, they were involved with that to tell the British where all those transport were.
General Auchinleck regroups his 8th Army. He orders his men to attack everything they see and to not stop advancing.
The Crusader operation did succeed in breaking through to Tobruk, so they relieved Tobruk, and also they inflicted substantial losses on Rommel's forces. And Rommel went right back to where basically he started earlier in the year and prepared for another attack, which he didn't waste very much time in launching.
With Operation Crusader over, the German forces have only to deal with desert conditions as they await Rommel's next move.
The saber is hot. Even when we were cooking our eggs, boiled eggs, we put it on the panzer, which is the tanks. And we had, a sunny side up eggs or stuff like that. Well, you get used to it, but still, we were happy when the sun was down, when it was away, but still.
Rommel hurries to complete preparations for another attack before the British do. Both sides know by now that the first blow is the one most likely to win the battle for Tobruk. On January 21st, 1942, armed with more than 100 new German tanks, Rommel initiates his move. Rommel draws British tanks into baited traps, using strategies which brought him victories several months earlier. Whenever the British chase German armor, they suddenly come face to face with Rommel's batteries. He also cuts off British units from being able to link up.
We were always on the alert. We just follow the orders, what we have to do, and that's it. was very difficult because we didn't have any trenches. When we were fighting, I mean, it was very hard to find a place to hide. No trees, no palm trees, nothing. Sometime I have seen English troops, and I mean, I don't know if I killed them or not. You should shoot and that's it. You don't care, you know, I mean, it is sad to say that, but if I would have shot him, maybe I would have been killed.
The British decided to pull back, and this time when the Germans reached Tobruk, they attacked it, and the port fell, which was a big shock.
June 20th, Rommel makes his final attack. Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers blast a wide gap in the minefields. Germans charge in from all directions. Within 24 hours, Tobruk surrenders. Nearly 35,000 British are taken prisoners.
The fall of Tobruk took place very quickly. It severely affected the campaign in North Africa, losing Tobruk. The fact that there was no force on the flank of the Germans meant that the Germans didn't have to worry about being attacked from behind. And it was perhaps Rommel's most spectacular success.
The capture of Tobruk brings Rommel a promotion to field marshal and an elevation in the eyes of Allied generals. They will now have to deal with his reputation as being invincible. Johann Sen would remain in Africa and Rommel's Panzer Army to face the British at the Battle of El Alamein.
Rommel was strictly a professional soldier. We were not even thinking about Hitler. Rommel was our god.
The loss of Tobruk severely compromised the British position in Egypt. It meant that the Germans could bring almost all their forces to bear on that line.
With the capture of Tobruk, Rommel's greatest gain is over 2 million gallons of badly needed gasoline, which will fuel his move into Egypt. However, Hitler has other plans for the Panzer Army, and the British have other plans for Rommel.